Put Mike. The committee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. Our first order of business is to note that today many Ethiopians are celebrating the start of the new year under the Ethiopian calendar, so I want to wish our friends a very, very happy new year and many more to come. Many of the hearings that this subcommittee has held over the years, especially on Ethiopia, have been focusing on criticism, raising fundamental human rights issues in Ethiopia. As a matter of fact, I introduced the bill back more than 10 years ago, the Ethiopia Human Rights Act. But today, however, strikes a far different tone, one not of criticism, but of commendation for the great strides Ethiopia has made since Prime Minister Abiy assumed authority in April of this year. Consider where we were just a year ago. A state of emergency existed, and thousands of political prisoners languished in jail. A Cold War standoff existed between Ethiopia and its neighbor Eritrea. And of course, people in prisons were being tortured and mistreated in the most horrific of ways. As this subcommittee pointed out in the hearing we held in March of 2017, and I quote, increasingly, repressive policy have diminished political space and threatened to radicalize not only the political opposition, but also civil society by frustrating their ability to exercise their rights under law. In response to this, I introduced, along with original co-sponsors Karen Bass and Mike Coffin, my good friend and colleague, H-Res 128, a resolution supporting respect for human rights and encouraging inclusive governance in Ethiopia. The resolution set forth milestones which needed to be met and passed thanks to the leaderships of so many, including our chairman, Ed Royce, our ranking member, Elliot Engel, and of course, Kevin McCarthy and the Speaker, who ensured that the bill got to the floor in a timely fashion. But success of this measure was due in the largest part to the efforts of the Ethiopian diaspora community in the United States, which came together to demand that egregious human rights abuses immediately cease and that fundamental human rights must be promoted and protected for all in Ethiopia. Indeed, one of the greatest collateral benefits brought about by the passage of H-Res 128 is the political effectiveness of the Ethiopian American community, which provided a textbook civics lesson for all of us to admire and to emulate. It is thanks to their tireless efforts of contacting their congressional representatives, of providing very, very good insights as to what was going on the ground, and making the case in a persistent manner that helped spur Congress to action. Since assuming office, Prime Minister Abiy has begun to implement some of the very reforms that H-Res 128 called for. He has released thousands, I say again, thousands of political prisoners and lifted the state of emergency. But he has also reached out to the diaspora community, catalyzed an end to the schism that had plagued the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and initiated an historic peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea this past July. Indeed, it is hoped that his domestic reforms will also inspire Eritrea, which remains a repressive regime, to undertake similar internal reforms. As an aside, Eritrea must reform. Some estimates put it at more than 10,000 prisoners being held unjustly, including 2 U.S. Embassy staff and 1 young Eritrean American named Siham Al-Abadu. This then is an opportunity and an opportune moment for Eritrea as well to enact justice reforms, release political prisoners, and end coercive conscription policies. If that country did this, it would become, too, a critical U.S. strategic partner and it could be professionalize its military so as to contribute to peacekeeping missions. Just a few weeks ago, Ranking Member Karen Bass and I visited, and our staff, the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa, where we met with Prime Minister Abiy and a very broad array, of individuals and groups, including His Holiness Abun Matthias I. One impression I had was a profound feeling of change and optimism, the likes of which I have not seen in Ethiopia ever. For what he has accomplished in less than half a year, the Prime Minister deserves praise and encouragement. Yet we still must keep in mind that expectations have been raised and the reforms he has begun must continue. For example, the notorious Charities and Society Proclamation and the Anti-Terrorism Proclamation, both passed in 2009, remain on the books and thus retain the potential to stifle legitimate civil society organizations and political speech. Many former prisoners and torture victims still demand justice. Ranking Member Bass and I met with several groups of torture victims in Addis, and what they described as having what they went through was absolutely horrific. One refrain we heard over and over, including from the Orthodox Church, is that there is a need for a truth and reconciliation in order for the country to move forward. There also needs to be an opportunity for people who have been displaced to return home. Catholic Archbishop Abraham Desta of Mekki recently brought to my attention that over 2.5 million people are internally displaced and require the government's immediate attention, especially by providing education for displaced children as the school year has already started. The economy needs to grow to provide jobs for many youth, including those who have participated in protests and civic disobedience. Reforms in the economic sector, including liberalization and deregulation, as well as an opening of economy to ethnic groups that have not been fully enfranchised, needs to continue. It also has been said that the reforms begun by Prime Minister Abiy represent a, quote, once-in-a-generation opportunity for Ethiopia. It is thus absolutely crucial that this opportunity be seized and in no way squandered. With this in mind, the United States must remain a strong partner with Ethiopia, someone we know that they can call upon, and I know we are, and we're so grateful to have our Assistant Secretary, who was the former ambassador to Ethiopia, here today. We collaborate on counterterrorism measures. We support and are grateful for Ethiopia's contribution to peacekeeping. Indeed, with more than 12,000 troops deployed between UN and AU missions, Ethiopia is the largest contributor to peacekeeping missions worldwide, and we must continue to encourage Ethiopia to participate in international military education training, or IMET, military professionalism programs. I also was encouraged by our conversations with Military Chief of Staff General Mekonnen on training Ethiopian peacekeepers on fighting the blight of human trafficking. Ethiopia is currently a Tier 2 country. As the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I will be strongly advocating that all anti-trafficking training be included in our IMET training for Ethiopian peacekeepers. And again, they're not Tier 1, which is the best tier, to try to help them make progress in that, in a broad range of trafficking issues in that country. I do believe, having met the man and having had an opportunity to engage in substantive discourse with him, Prime Minister Abiy is the right man for the right time and therefore deserving of our support. Finally, and speaking of support, I want to especially thank our ambassador, Mike Raynor, our Deputy Chief of Mission, Troy Fitcherell, and Political Officer Wilson Corral, as well as all of our embassy staff for the support that they gave for our delegation. Their professionalism and their dedication should give us great confidence that our relationship with the Prime Minister and his staff and country will remain strong, and we will move forward together. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass. Any opening comments?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you, Juan, for leading the CODEL and having us go down, even though it was a short trip. I think we were able to accomplish a lot, and especially for holding this hearing today. I want to welcome the Assistant Secretary. Thank you for your time coming and addressing us today. With the transition to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, it is an opportune time to take a closer look at our bilateral relationship and what opportunities exist to strengthen the bond between our two nations. As Africa's fastest growing economy and its second most populous country, Ethiopia is a key regional partner for the U.S. The last few years, while unstable and at times chaotic, have led to a peaceful transition of power to Africa's youngest leader. Prime Minister's initial efforts are promising and have elicited effusive headlines from international news publications. However, we do know that he faces daunting challenges ahead, including regional security issues, the country's past human rights record, ethnic tensions across the country, and hardliners within the EPRDF that hope to stall his reform agenda. And I think holding this hearing today and beginning this process of examining our relationship, it's really an opportunity for us to figure out, as the U.S., how we can help move Ethiopia forward, especially in this time period. And then relations with Somalia and Eritrea continue to be Ethiopia's top security concerns, and we know that the government will need to address tensions with Somalia, as well as its key role in counterterrorism efforts. Ethiopia will also need to navigate rapprochement with Eritrea while easing concerns from its own citizens over a recent peace deal ending a decades-long stalemate. Despite these challenges, I will say for the last 14 years, I've represented a large Ethiopian community in Los Angeles. We even have a section of town that's called Little Ethiopia. And for the last 14 years, the diaspora has been so concerned and so upset at what was taking place in their homeland. And to me, it's just been so inspiring to see the Ethiopian diaspora and the people in Ethiopia, and when we visited, that are really encouraged and excited about the possibility of moving forward and recognizing that there are daunting challenges. We did face a little pushback when we were there over our resolution 128, and some people voiced why did we do it at that particular time? What was our timing? What were we trying to say? And the chairman and I had an opportunity to explain that you know, the resolution was not trying to, well, was trying to be encouraging and wanting things to move forward, and was not trying to slap Ethiopia right when change was occurring. We had an opportunity to really discuss that with many people. I'm looking forward to seeing how we can provide continuing support, but how our support might change. I mean, one of the things that we know is going to be a challenge is governance, preparing for elections. When we met with the Prime Minister was very clear that he wanted to see change take place, but he was not wedded to be the Prime Minister forever, and he made that point very clear with us. We had the opportunity to meet with different ethnic groups and for them to express their concerns, and I think that one of the challenges that Ethiopia is going to face now is how to do the reconciliation, how to account for human rights abuses that took place in the past, how to account for that, and how to bring people together at the same time. And then when we spoke with the Prime Minister, you know, he was clear, we want to move the country forward, and we'll have to figure out the truth and reconciliation process along the way, but we can't stop and just focus on the grievances from the past. We absolutely have to do that healing, but we have to move the country forward. I want to welcome my colleague, Mr. Garamendi from Northern California, who's here, and I know he'll speak in a minute. But I was particularly happy to have him come here because Mr. Garamendi lived in Ethiopia and was a member of the Peace Corps many years ago, and in all those years since has maintained contact with the village in which he served. Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Yes, thank you very much for that, and we will recognize Mr. Garamendi in a moment. But I would like to yield to Mr. Kaufman from Colorado, who has been a tenacious promoter of human rights in Ethiopia. And as the ranking member pointed out, you know, when we brought this up in April, Prime Minister Abe had already obviously assumed office, but we introduced this in 2017. In February of 2017, we went through some rewrites because things were changing on the ground, and frankly, we gave to his government a prescriptive list of what the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, expected would happen. And it has been very telling just how close many of the things that on a bipartisan basis we had recommended, starting with the release of political prisoners, have happened. So we hope that the resolution has made some difference. And as I said earlier, it does go back to 2005 after I visited with President Melis and was profoundly disappointed with his human rights abuses, which was legion at the time, and stressed and then introduced the human rights bill at that point towards Ethiopia. So thank you, Ms. Bass. We've worked very closely on this, and the trip, I think, was a great success, and it's part of it ongoing. Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass. First, I'd like to thank Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and the rest of the Africa Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations Subcommittee for allowing me to participate in today's hearing. I have the distinct honor of representing the largest Ethiopian community in Colorado, I think one of the largest in the United States, that is in my congressional district. And over the past few years, it has been my pleasure to get to know them, listen to their concerns, and work on their behalf here in Washington, D.C. I'm also very proud to have two of my constituents, Mr. Garoom Alimayu here today, and Jamal Syed, to offer their thoughts on the current situation in Ethiopia. What we have seen in Ethiopia over the past few months has been entirely remarkable. New reforms and changes under the leadership of Prime Minister Abiy have started Ethiopia on what I believe to be a stronger path of inclusion, democracy, and new freedoms. It is of the utmost importance that the United States can show to Ethiopia and the Ethiopian people that we stand side by side with them as these reforms occur, and that we are able to provide assistance whenever and wherever possible. House Resolution 128, which was passed by the House of Representatives on April 10th, has played an important role in illustrating the commitment that the United States has concerning the people of Ethiopia. This legislation called on the government of Ethiopia to make clear, decisive steps towards becoming more inclusive, more democratic, and more respectful of the basic human rights of its own citizens. I was very glad to see House Resolution 128 enjoy such bipartisan support from the Foreign Affairs Committee as well as in the full House of Representatives. While progress has been made, we must also be aware of the steps that are still required to be taken to address some of the remaining issues within Ethiopia. Specifically, there are still very troubling reports of ethnic violence taking place in the country where many have died and hundreds of thousands have been displaced from their homes. We also still want the results of the FBI's investigation into the grenade attack on June 24th, which occurred at a rally for the new Prime Minister and resulted in multiple deaths and injuries, as well as what further actions may be required to be taken. The Ethiopian government needs to be able to show that it can protect all of its citizens to be free, and also that it takes great concern with the reports of continuing violations of human rights. Again, I would like to thank the subcommittee for inviting me to today's proceedings, and I look forward to listening to witnesses' testimonies as we continue to this important discussion on how the United States and the House of Representatives can support Ethiopia as it works towards addressing some of these remaining concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. The chair recognizes my good friend and colleague from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass. It's a privilege to be with you. This committee has been of extraordinary importance in all the work that you do, and personally important to me because of your work in Africa and specifically Ethiopia. It was 50 years ago that my wife and I were Peace Corps volunteers in southwestern Ethiopia. I could attempt to say Tenaisalin and Demanachu to all, maybe Kunja too, try my Oromia. In any case, yes, we've gone back and forth to Ethiopia over many, many years. The current situation in Ethiopia is extraordinarily positive, and I, along with most others, remain very, very optimistic about where this new government will lead Ethiopia. There are certainly going to be issues that will affect the citizens and people in the area. It's a complex country with many ethnicities and languages and incredible economic challenges and challenges from the neighborhood. I would encourage all of us to be attentive, not to be patient, but to also understand the complexities that face Ethiopia. I know that the current government, Mr. Abiy Ahmed, is doing everything he can. Of particular note, and I noticed the ambassador's time in Ethiopia when the Eritrean-Ethiopian war was in full underway with tens of thousands of people dying, that the peace negotiations that occurred during that time, in which a team of returned volunteers had a role, has apparently now taken hold after some 17 years of passage. That's a good thing. It'll allow the northern part, in fact, all of Ethiopia and Eritrea, to enjoy the benefits of peace and the reduction of the military attention that that area has had. There's much to be done. This committee is extremely important, and I really want to thank the committee for the opportunity to be here and to follow along. Know that my wife and I will continue to always love Ethiopia and the people of Ethiopia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now yield to our distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, as I pointed out during this subcommittee hearing and the full committee hearings, and as I'm sure our witness today is more aware of than I am, we're really at a turning point as it relates to Ethiopia's march forward. There are certain demographic and geographical realities on the ground. For example, there is 15.5 times as much land area in the nation state of Russia as in Ethiopia, and yet the population of Russia is about 35 plus or minus million greater than that of Ethiopia. And so we have a lot of people in a relatively small area, which creates problems in and of itself, particularly when we consider the birth rates therein. And this isn't necessarily a good or bad thing, although I will point out the amazing diversity and vibrant cultural contributions, as well as contributions in the realms of the arts and sciences, et cetera, that go back literally millennia to the region. But if we don't start to get it right, we may not be able to reel it back in. And so I'm encouraged by Prime Minister Abiy's steps. I think that we are headed in the right direction, but certainly as it relates to regional stability, which I think I could articulate and argue plays in the 21st century directly into global stability, we need to make sure we get this right. And so, Mr. Chairman, members of the panel, it's important that what we do here today, that we formulate policy in the United States appropriate to our role as an outside nation to encourage and support Ethiopia as it tries to develop economically, educationally, culturally, socially, and that we stand and speak with a clear voice as it relates to civil societies, as it relates to best practices, engaging disparate elements and opinions, because we won't have today over again. So with that, I thank the chairman for calling this meeting, and I thank the members of the panel. I hope that we can do good work for the future here today.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished leader in the job for a month, but certainly a very wise and experienced Africa hand, a man who has done tremendous work over the years. Tibor Nagy is the Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Africa Affairs. Ambassador Nagy has spent over 32 years in government service, including 20 years in assignments across Africa. He served as United States Ambassador to Ethiopia from 1999 to 2002, and the United States Ambassador to Guinea from 1996 to 99. He also served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Nigeria from 93 to 95, in Cameroon from 1990 to 93, and in Togo from 87 to 1990. After his retirement from the Foreign Service and before being called back into service, Ambassador Nagy was Vice Provost for International Affairs at Texas Tech University from 2003 to 2018. Ambassador Nagy has received numerous awards for his service, including recognition for helping prevent famine in Ethiopia and supporting efforts to end the Ethiopian-Eritrean War. He has lectured nationally on Africa development and U.S. diplomacy and serves as a regular op-ed contributor to the Lupak Avalanche Journal newspaper on global events. Ambassador Naj is also co-author of Kishir Latte Goodbye, Managing Overseas Operations, the nonfiction winner of the 2014 Paris Book Festival. He came to the United States in 1957 as a political refugee from Hungary. He received his BA from Texas Tech, MSA from George Washington University, and he and his wife, Eva Jane, have 3 children, and the first triplets to be born in independent Zimbabwe. We welcome you, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Ambassador, to the committee, and again, we thank you for your extraordinary service for so many decades, and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Boss, and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today on U.S. national interests and recent developments in Ethiopia. I also wanted to take the opportunity of this hearing, my first before you, to address Eritrea and the regional significance of the improving relationships between Ethiopia and Eritrea. As a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, this topic is of great importance to me personally, so it is a real pleasure to be here with you today. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, I also want to thank you for your recent trip to Ethiopia. I greatly appreciate the focus the Congress has on this region, which I believe is very important for our national interests, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss recent developments with the subcommittee. Allow me to open our time today with some thematic remarks on recent developments. In Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has initiated groundbreaking reforms across most every area of Ethiopian society since becoming Prime Minister on April 2nd, 2018. He deserves tremendous credit for his boldness in tackling issues that previous governments have not addressed. We have a strong relationship with the highest reaches of the new administration, which reflects not only our century-long diplomatic relations with Ethiopia, the only country in sub-Saharan Africa which was never colonized, but also our great support for Dr. Abiy's reform vision. Implementing this reform vision is not without its challenges, and to make such broad and rapid changes will require reinforcing the foundation for the relationship between the Ethiopian people and its government. We have seen Dr. Abiy do so, actively engaging with the public to support his government as it works to implement reforms. In July, he came to the United States to meet with the Ethiopian diaspora members, many of whom are enthusiastic participants in our own electoral process and care greatly for their homeland. Dr. Abiy has also taken dramatic steps to end the former government's repression of civil liberties, inviting a diversity of voices, including many who were previously criminalized, to participate in Ethiopia's future. Yet, strengthening institutions, setting the economy on a firm footing, and restoring stability to areas facing humanitarian disaster and ethnic conflict will not be done overnight. The expectations of the Ethiopian people are also incredibly high, and many of them are young. We estimate that there are around 70 million Ethiopians younger than 30, many of whom have participated in protests in recent years due to frustration with corruption and the lack of economic opportunity. The Ethiopian government has openly sought partnership with the United States to achieve its ambitious reform plans. We have a tremendous opportunity to support Ethiopia as a friend and partner in the process. We are working to provide support to Dr. Abiy and his administration across all of these challenges as he continues his work in years ahead. But looking more broadly at regional issues, we enthusiastically welcome Dr. Abiy and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki working together to end 20 years of conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. There is still much work to do to repair the consequences of the conflict for the peoples of both countries, especially in border regions. But we have already seen a tremendous outpouring of emotion on both sides supporting peace, and both governments have highlighted the positive consequences this will bring for the entire Horn of Africa. We support both sides as they explore possibilities for peace and continue to encourage and support their long-term success. But guaranteeing the full benefits of peace for years to come will depend on the strength of all parties' efforts to restore friendship and prosperity to both countries. And this must be done as inclusively as possible, including with other important partners in the region and beyond. Since Eritrea's mid-June decision to send a delegation to Ethiopia, there have been several meetings between the two government's officials in Asmara, Addis Ababa, and capitals across the Horn of Africa to discuss trade, development, and tourism. So far, the public and tangible examples of improved relations are the reopening of telephone service and the resumption of regular flights between both countries. And since this was written, they just opened their land borders yesterday at 2 points, which was remarkable. Eritrea is also expanding capacity at the port of Massawa for use by Ethiopia, and it was just announced early in September that an Ethiopian commercial vessel used the port of Massawa for the first outbound shipment on an Ethiopian vessel since the peace agreement. We anticipate that these and other steps will create the potential for greater development and people-to-people ties on both sides of the border. Peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea leads us to another remarkable story. Eritrea's reemergence onto the regional and global stage and the many potential opportunities for the United States stemming from regional peace. With Ethiopia and Eritrea's conflict ending, we see strong potential for Eritrea's contribution to improving regional security. Eritrea has resisted extremist threats and could provide lessons to others on how to maintain a diversity of communities free from violent extremism. Eritrea can also contribute to regional peace and stability, as we have seen with Eritrea's engagement with Somalia and South Sudan, and Eritrea's role brokering agreement among Ethiopian opposition groups. Eritrea, which has a strong tradition of self-sufficiency and independence, could also promote a stronger regional approach to countering potentially malign influences of global competitors operating in the region. Nonetheless, we still have significant concerns in our bilateral relations with Eritrea that we will continue to highlight in days ahead. Eritrea currently continues to imprison several of our embassy's locally employed staff members for politically motivated reasons. We have also raised concerns about the detention of American citizens who are detained for the same reasons. Though Eritrea has regularly asserted that it has no substantive relationship with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Eritrea has not fully explained certain past arms procurement transactions between Eritrea and the DPRK that the UN panel of experts reported. Broader human rights concerns, such as indefinite, obligatory national service, the arbitrary detention of religious and political prisoners, and a tightly controlled, opaque system of government, also hinder our scope for cooperation. The United States has deliberately engaged with Eritrea in recent months with both these opportunities and concerns in full view, and we will continue to do so. Although we have already seen many gains from peace, which the President and the Secretary of State have both hailed publicly, further progress will require more action on some of these priority issues in Eritrea. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Secretary, again, for your leadership and for being here today. I do have a number of questions, and I'll ask them in somewhat succession. We do have a number of members here today, and I think that's a good sign of the concern that we all have. Let me start with sex trafficking and trafficking in general. Again, it's an area that I have spent more than 25 years working on and written a number of laws on, and I raise it everywhere, every time I go. And Ethiopia does have a problem. Prime Minister Abiy inherited a very significant problem with child sex tourism, which remains unabated in Addis Ababa, Bahir Dar, Haswa, and Bishoftu, to name at least some areas where it is very, very rampant. Convictions have dropped. In 2016, there were 640. In 2017, it dropped to 182. Very bad trend line because we know the problem has not gone away. And on the positive note, last month, Sudan and Ethiopia signed an agreement to work together on their border to fight against human trafficking. I think that was a great step forward. And when Karen Bass and I met with Chief of Staff General Mekunen, We asked him, I asked him, we both really strongly made the point that his soldiers need to be trained in how to mitigate human trafficking, to spot it, to be on the side of protection and not on the side of exploitation. He seemed very open to it, especially when we mentioned the IMET training, that, that might be an area where we could include this. And I wonder if you could just speak to that, because I think what we emphasize, because he has so many issues and problems he has to deal with all at once, and I think there is a key here or a concern that we need to all manage expectations. It's not all going to be done in a day, but I think this needs to be emphasized very, very strongly. Secondly, if I could, and that is on the issue of the internally displaced, 2.6 million displaced, about 1 million IDPs in Eastern Oromia. What are we doing to try to help them in their humanitarian crisis, which is obviously severe? We've also raised on our trip, and we're doing it again here, we've done it in our resolution and elsewhere, the use of torture against so many individuals. I know the Prime Minister has cleaned house of some of the worst, but we know in Meklawe prison, which is finally being shut down, we heard stories of people who had been grossly mistreated, and obviously the guards and others who were a part of that need to be held to account. And finally, the whole issue of China's influence, and I know you're very concerned about that as well. The debt that they're piling on one African country after another that will become unsustainable in exchange for their minerals, their oil, their wood. It's a one-way ticket to Beijing in terms of the net benefits of that relationship, and I think Ethiopia is beginning to understand that themselves. So maybe you could speak to that as well.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. 4 extremely important areas to address. Maybe I can take them in reverse order. The Chinese one is extremely important, and that's one that is of great personal interest to me. I think the Ethiopians definitely understand that China is not the long-term solution for their problems. I think it's true in just about all of Africa that the greatest problems they're going to face is this demographic wave of the population doubling between now and 2050. And the solution all comes down, it sounds simplistic, but it's really not, but it comes down to jobs, jobs, jobs for the young people. And Prime Minister Abiy, I think, is one of those enlightened leaders that fully comprehends that to take Ethiopia on a road to prosperity and stability, it requires creating jobs, jobs, jobs for those millions and millions and millions of young people where, huge percentage of the population will be under 15. And that is not going to come from trade with China. So he is extremely eager to open up trade and commerce in Ethiopia with other companies. They are reaching out to us, as are a number of other African countries. And I think it's extremely important for the United States to engage with him. Obviously, not only that area, but that area is critically important to their long-term future. And that will require several strategic steps, because of course it will require work on the part of Ethiopia to put in the kind of enabling environment which will be welcoming to other companies besides Chinese, and I think that they're very eager to proceed on that. It will also require work on the United States government's part to help the Ethiopians technically in those areas. And then finally, it will also require us to reach out to American companies to go to Africa, because unlike China, we don't have state-owned corporation and state-owned banks to where we order companies to go to countries X, Y, and Z and invest so much money. American companies, I know, are eager to invest in Africa, especially Ethiopia has now a phenomenal reputation. And in many cases, companies want to do that, but they find it difficult because they're not sure that the environment is right for them. So it's a cycle that we actually have to step into and work on to help Prime Minister Abiy succeed. In the area of the use of torture, extremely important area. The United States, of course.
While you're answering, if you just add to that answer, the Torture Victims Relief Act, and I authored 4 of those over the years, provide for that intervention for PTSD especially? Is that something that you would consider, you know, helping the Ethiopian government obtain, because those best practices lead maybe not to a cure, but to an ability to overcome the nightmares to a great extent?
Absolutely, and we've had experience doing this before. I remember when I was ambassador in Guinea, the whole region was engulfed in Liberian and Sierra Leonean civil war, and the United States became quite active in working with the victims of torture to try to help them overcome that. As a matter of fact, we worked with Peace Corps to introduce a brand new program to where third-year volunteers could actually have had the competent abilities to work in the camps, specifically with the torture victims. So, as you said, Mr. Chairman, the military and the security forces are having to work on so many issues at the same time, but this is one that is critically important. And it's also one that the Ethiopians are going to have a national dialogue on, because different countries in Africa have had different approaches to this kind of internal peace and reconciliation post-trauma. Liberians did it one way, Sierra Leoneans did it another way, the South Africans, of course, did it a certain way, and it has to be done culturally, but as you said yourself, they do have to come to some kind of resolution, because otherwise it's a poison that will exist in their society going forward. We, of course, it's not for the United States to tell other countries how to do it, but we certainly have to be prepared to support when asked to do so. And I was delighted to hear you say that even the military are interested in this. So that would be another one. On the internally displaced, as usual, the United States does step forward very quickly. I was very pleased to see this, that in July, the U.S. government announced more than $170 million in humanitarian assistance for the emergency response in Ethiopia. I mean, we are there. The internally displaced numbers are horrifying. They go back several years, although recently, because of the emergency that happened in Somalia and the brief violence that took part there, that added another great number of internally displaced. So we are there. USAID, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, Food for Peace, and we will continue to be there to monitor and to help whatever way we can. And let's see, I think the last one was the trafficking in persons. Again, I think you have a situation with Ethiopia where you have a transitioning government with the enlightenment to want to change things. Their problem comes up is that they have to change things in so many critical areas. And even the security forces, again, they want to improve. We want them to improve. Would love to see nothing more than to see them get up to that Tier 1 status. And they want to engage with us. We want to engage with them. We have made specific recommendations, so we will work with them on that very actively to help them get there. It's very rarely that you have a government with so many good intentions.
Thank you. It might be worthwhile to configure a trip with the tip office.
Yes.
Because they are experts and they have, you know, a wealth of best practices that they could share. Ranking Member Bass.
Thank you very much. And again, Assistant Secretary, I really appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to welcoming you on Friday at the Africa Brain Trust that the Congressional Black Caucus is doing, and I know the public will look forward to hearing your comments. I wanted to follow up with the discussion that you were having about the reconciliation process, and specifically, my questions want to know your opinions about what we can do in Congress to be helpful with the process. So, you know, when we met with the various groups, you know, top on their agenda was reconciliation. When we met with the Prime Minister, you know, you got a slightly different message. I mean, he understands how critically important it is, but at the same time, he doesn't want the country to be consumed by that. And so I just wanted to know your thoughts on what we might do that might be helpful.
I believe that the best thing to do would be for the United States of America, as voiced by the people's representatives, to recognize that Prime Minister Abiy has indicated an interest in going towards national reconciliation, the importance of national reconciliation, and that the United States stands ready to support any way possible to make that happen, as we did with South Africa, as we did with Liberia, as we did with Sierra Leone, to walk that fine line of not dictating, but recognizing and respecting, so that, as I said before, it does not become a poison in the future environment. It has to be taken out.
Do you think it's helpful to do a resolution, a sense of Congress, or some kind of statement, especially following on the heels of the resolution that we did?
I think resolutions are greatly paid attention to in Ethiopia. During my time as ambassador, I was called often by the Ethiopian government based on actions that Congress took. So it definitely would receive widespread.
That wasn't good, I take it.
Pardon me?
That was not good, I take it.
Well, yes, I was chewed out a fair number of times because I was, let me put it this way, credited with the action that in fact Congress took.
I see.
But in that regard, so I think it would definitely have its purposes, and as I mentioned, it definitely would be noticed by not only the Ethiopian government, but the larger Ethiopian community worldwide. And it's not just in the U.S. diaspora, it's, Ethiopians are around the world.
Right. Well, when you mentioned promoting U.S. business involvement in Ethiopia, and I agree with you 100%, but one way we also might look to be helpful, I mean, the diaspora has been involved in terms of business, but we might look for ways to promote that, especially the diaspora that has not felt they could really engage with the country because of prior administrations. So something that we might figure out what we could do to help promote diaspora business involvement as well, in addition to, the multinational corporations. I wanted to ask you also about Eritrea. With the opening of relations between the two countries, do you think, or do you have any sense at all whether the forced national service will continue? On the military side, considering what would the nature of it be, and especially given that that's one of the major reasons for the migration out of Eritrea, and the people getting on the boats and attempting to make it to Europe.
Representative Bass, you're absolutely right on that. Up to now, for the last 20+ years, Eritrea has used Ethiopia as an excuse to maintain what I would almost call a fortress state and have one of the largest standing armies in Africa, despite the size of their population, plus this heinous national service which never seemed to end. With the opening of peace, they really will no longer have a reason to do that. So we will be following events very closely to see what domestic steps the Eritrean government now takes to go along with their outward openings internationally, because I think it's critically important for Eritrea to do domestically the types of openings that they are doing internationally. I was astounded also a couple of days ago to see the presidents of Eritrea and Djibouti embracing on the tarmac of Asmara Airport. These events, for me, are mind-boggling. In my 40 years of following Africa, I've never seen this type of transition happen. I think it's a clear indication of the wonderful things that can happen from enlightened, strong leadership. Just like we have seen awful things happen around, unfortunately, the continent from other types of leadership, which is the opposite of that. And I hope that that serves as an example to President Isaias as well, that it leads to instant popularity. You don't have to have a repressive state when you're doing the right thing and you're taking your people's interests as your first goal.
Do you see our relationship having changed at all with Eritrea since the opening with Ethiopia?
The atmosphere has improved, I think, remarkably. But now let's get to the heart of the issue and let's get to actual events and actions. Because that also goes, for example, to the sanctions regime. Eritrea cannot assume that by saying wonderful things and opening good relations with the neighbors that will automatically lead to sanctions relief. There have to be concrete actions taken, and we, of course, will remain very engaged and, say things that will not always be popular, but they have to be said.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I yield to my good friend from Denver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real concern with these extraordinary numbers, high numbers of displaced individuals in Ethiopia and the ethnic tensions inside the country. Is there anything else that the United States can do to influence that situation in terms of getting better, reducing the tensions, and what is the Prime Minister able to do?
That also, thank you, sir. That's a phenomenal question, because ethnicity in Ethiopia is such a historically interesting issue. In one respect, Ethiopia, being a ethnic federalism, offers almost a unique model in Africa, based on how some of the other states have been structured because of the boundaries. So it offers that example. So ethnicity in Ethiopia has been a very stark issue. But then on the other hand, of all the places I've served in Africa, I have never met people like in Ethiopia who carry, all of them, a sense of Ethiopianness in their DNA, going back to 2,000 years of Ethiopian history. So it's one of those, two forces existing in the same place. I believe that Prime Minister Abiy recognizes that the best solution to ethnic friction is economic progress, economic opportunity for the young people who live there. Because if the opportunities exist, then there's really no reason to be having animosity towards that other ethnicity that may be in the other side of town. And I believe that he intends to work in that regard. We, of course, may be in position to offer programs, technical assistance in this regard, but I truly believe the heart of the issue and the heart of the solution really would be economic progress, to where the ethnic groups don't feel that urgency of competition just based on ethnicity.
Ambassador, you mentioned about the need to go through, for Ethiopia to go through a process of reconciliation. You gave some examples of different countries that have gone through a process of reconciliation. One of your examples is South Africa. Is South Africa in some way a model of reconciliation?
The only difference being there that in South Africa you have, of course, that racial dimension, which is almost unique to that country. In Zimbabwe it was at one time, but not to the extent in South Africa, which is quite a bit different from Ethiopia, because in Ethiopia it was not, of course, it was not a racial dimension or even so much of an ethnic dimension as just abuse of a segment of the population by a historicity of regimes going all the way back, in some respects, quite frankly, to the emperor, but then, of course, certainly the Mengistu regime, the successor regime led by Prime Minister Meles, and the post-Meles government, now the one that wants to take the lid off everything, let the light in, transparency, openness. It falls to them to, in many respects, it's unfair, because it falls to them to have to undo the harm that has been done in previous generations. But it has to be a restorative but also a cathartic experience.
Ambassador, what can we do to assist Ethiopia to try to make these changes, these reforms from the Abiy administration, the Prime Minister, sustainable?
To continue engagement, to take a whole-of-government approach, to mobilize all of our resources together and in commonality, to maintain an ongoing dialogue, to stay with it, and also to act as quickly as U.S. government is capable of acting, because he is moving very, very quickly. And he realizes also that the changes that he is bringing in are quite fragile, and that his people are expecting him to move quickly also and to show progress. So we have to be also very flexible and very deft, and I would like to also echo what the chairman said, that we are fortunate to have Ambassador Rayner in Addis at this time, and an extremely talented embassy staff. Our communications are constant. Their communications with Abiy's government, Prime Minister Abiy's government, are ongoing and constant. So we are going to all work together to be able to maximize the effectiveness of the U.S. government, because all of us want to see the same thing for a whole variety of reasons, from U.S. security to our business prosperity, but also to the regional stability in the greater Horn of Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mike. We're joined by the distinguished chairman of the full Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just make some general observations here, but let me begin by thanking you and the ranking member, Karen Bass, for the trip that you made to Ethiopia and the arguments you put forward. And let me also thank Mike Kaufman. We worked together on the resolution. And let me say that this issue, Mike, of advancing human rights in Ethiopia is one that I think we are somewhat encouraged by some of the recent events, but your observation that we need to sustain this progress, we need to see the Prime Minister's work sort of taken up as a long-term commitment by the government is important. The focus of the resolution was for the government in Ethiopia to address these human rights concerns head-on, and we've indeed, as I say, seen some commendable progress since then. When he took office in April, the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, took some pretty bold steps to reform Ethiopia's government, some pretty bold moves on the economy as well. And we have tens of thousands of political prisoners now that have been released. Many more in exile have felt safe enough to return home. That's what I'm told in Los Angeles and in Southern California by the community. Media freedom certainly has expanded from where it was. And in the government, I think in their public recognition about the need to systematically improve human rights conditions, have made the right commitments there. The economic reforms are encouraging, but many of them are proposed at this point. So we want to see full implementation and enforcement. There's also been historic progress towards resolving the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and we should comment on that because during my time as chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, we held a number of hearings on the brutal conflict between these two countries. Years later, we can finally look upon the conflict with cautious optimism. The recent reconciliation between these two countries is very encouraging. Genuine peace and improved economic and security cooperation, of course, would bring stability, would bring mutual prosperity to both Ethiopians and Eritreans. But I think this is just the beginning. The road ahead for Prime Minister Abiy's government will be a very challenging road. It must increase accountability of government officials. You've got to do something about accountability of the security forces. It will ensure that all citizens' voices are heard and respected. The U.S. and Ethiopia have long enjoyed a strong bilateral relationship. I enjoyed the opportunity with the CODEL we took to Ethiopia, and I know my colleague sacrificed a lot of time and effort there, John, when you were in Ethiopia at a very difficult time with the Peace Corps. Americans are rooting for an Ethiopia on the mend, and everything we see is encouraging. So our committee will continue to track developments and look forward to further strengthening the partnership, further strengthening Ethiopia's efforts towards becoming a more free, a more inclusive, a more prosperous nation. And I thank the Assistant Secretary for his engagement in all of this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to Mr. Garamendi.
Once again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the privilege of joining your subcommittee for this hearing. Extremely important hearing. Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Royce, thank you for your many years of attention to Africa and Ethiopia in that process, and Mr. Kaufman the same. Just a couple of things. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and the new National Defense Strategy emphasizes Russia and China. The result of that apparently is a movement by the Department of Defense to move away from Africa, particularly the Sahel and areas of violent extreme organizations. I draw that to the attention of this committee. The interrelationship between the work of this committee and the Armed Services Committees with regard to the role of the Department of Defense and the State Department in Africa deserves our attention. Of specific interest beyond that is some of the questions that have arisen with regard to the current famine, drought that's occurring on the eastern portions of Ethiopia and probably going to move beyond that. The work of this committee in pushing back on the $300 million rescission in the food aid programs is much appreciated, I think, by certainly by everybody that pays attention to what's going on in those countries. And I would draw and ask the ambassador and assistant secretary about what specifically is taking place with regard to support for famine relief and in the area, as well as security issues. And with that, I would yield back.
Thank you very much. On famine relief, our Food for Peace for Ethiopia is at $373 million. And Ethiopia, as you know from your time there, unfortunately suffers periodic famine. And each time the United States tends to be the first one there. I had the same thing happen during my ambassadorship, where we were actually able to stem off the famine. And the types of famine that hit it are of two varieties. Sometimes, unfortunately, the famine is in the highlands, and sometimes it's in the lowlands. Totally different requirements, but I'm always honored to be associated with the United States of America, because thanks to your generosity and the generosity of the American people, we're always the first ones there to respond, and we will certainly continue to do so going forward. Whatever it takes, we're always the most generous. And I always, in my lecturing at Texas Tech, I always thank the American farmers, because we had many of those kids in the classes. On the security front, of course, Ethiopia is one of our most important partners, not just in the region, but also throughout Africa. As I believe the chairman mentioned, Ethiopia is the largest troop contributor to UN peacekeeping operations. They contribute troops to several operations in Sudan, and then bilaterally they do it in Somalia, because it's their neighbor, and Somalia is critically important to their own peace and well-being. That's one of the other reasons this ongoing peace process between neighbors, one after the other, is so critically important. From my own experience in Ethiopia, I recognize the Ethiopian Armed Forces as one of the most professional I've ever worked with, and we depend on them for maintaining peace and security throughout the Greater Horn, and we will certainly continue that engagement.
Could you, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, could you speak briefly about Sudan, Southern Sudan?
Well, of course, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, IGAD, everybody has been devastated by the events in South Sudan. We were so optimistic when the country gained its independence. And what has happened since then has been devastating. And a little while ago, I was mentioning of what a huge difference one enlightened leader who actually cares passionately about their own people, what a difference that has made to Ethiopia. And I mentioned the opposite of that. And I fear that that's exactly what we have seen in South Sudan. The current peace process is the only peace process we have going. We hope that it will succeed. And of course, we will do our best to be supportive because everybody wants to see peace and reconciliation there. Unfortunately, the leadership, to say that that it was disheartening is an understatement.
The role of Ethiopia in that has been long-term and significant, and I assume it's remaining so.
Yes, sir, absolutely. Ethiopia, of course, has been tremendously helpful on a number of fronts. Both Sudan, South Sudan, when Sudan was still one country, because I remember when I was ambassador, I had a number of conversations with then Prime Minister Meles about the whole Sudanese, at the time of the Civil War. And then, of course, the other neighbor, Somalia. So Ethiopia has been a very positive force for stability and peace on both of those fronts. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Just let me ask you a few final questions, if I could. Mr. Secretary, you know, I've been to South Sudan twice within the last 2.5 years or so, and like you, am greatly distressed over Salva Kiir's performance and how destabilizing it has been, and the loss of life in not just South Sudan, but the explosion of refugees and IDPs from that man-made crisis. So we wish you well as Assistant Secretary for all of Africa, of course, in your help, in your efforts there. Just a small recommendation would be to consider bringing former President George W. Bush back into it. He and Salva Kiir did hit it off well. Kiir still wears the hat given to him by President Bush.
That's right.
And I think President Bush would be more than helpful and I think effective in saying, get with the program, Mr. President, end the complicity of your troops with rape and pillaging of foodstuffs, World Food Program and our own, of course, being stolen by some of them. It's just awful. So if you could maybe take that back. But let me just ask a question. In Abyei, as we all know, the disputed border between Sudan and South Sudan, Ethiopian peacekeepers have played a huge role. And we know that there's consideration being given to downgrading the withdrawal of mechanized artillery units, replacing them with police. When we met with General Mekonnen, he voiced his extreme concern about that, and I would hope you would take that back, that it could actually make the situation worse. And he also made the point that he may even withdraw all of his troops. So I do hope that that's something you might want to speak to, because I think every dollar we invest in UN peacekeeping, especially in a place like Abyei, is a dollar well served. You know, the mission supports it. Any efforts at cost cutting, I think, would be not achieved because there could be the loss of life. Also, some of our witnesses will follow. So if you could speak to that, we'll follow in a moment in panel 2, including Jamal Saeed. And we heard this while we were there, and of course we pushed this in our resolution. And that is the idea of having a commission investigation, perhaps a peace and reconciliation commission that parallels what South Africa did, what El Salvador did after its terrible war with the FMLN, to try to weed out the bad apples, hold them to account, and move on to a reconciliation process that is, you know, leads to a stronger and more human rights-oriented Ethiopia. So if you could speak to those. And finally, there was in our witness testimony from Emily Estelle from AEI. She makes a number of excellent points, but one of them is that sustained conflicts risk mobilizing Ethiopia's Somali population, potentially causing a new opportunity for Al-Shabaab to recruit or even expand its attacks into Ethiopia. Your assessment of that risk of those Somalis who obviously live in and around Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, if you permit me, I'll take those in reverse.
Sure.
With the Somali situation, indeed, one of the reasons that the Somali regional state of Ethiopia had such a large police force what the so-called Liu police, there were so many of them, was exactly the reason to make sure that Al-Shabaab stays out of the Ethiopian Somali region. Unfortunately, the local political forces were working for ill. They used the Liu police for actually, human rights violations, for repressing the local population. And when Prime Minister Abiy recently changed the Somali leadership, they were largely responsible for some of the violence and mayhem in the Somali region. Prime Minister Abiy and the Ethiopian leadership is very concerned with the potential for Al-Shabaab influence and entry into the Somali region, so they are keeping their eyes on that. And the Ethiopian security forces are also very sensitive to that issue. So we definitely will engage on that because that fits obviously in with U.S. strategic interests on that one. On the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, again, I absolutely embrace that suggestion, and I would just underline that with the Ethiopians, it's a system that they will need to develop unique to their culture, their history, how they want to go about it, and we will be as supportive as we can be, as we have been in a number of other situations around the world. And the South African one obviously was a very effective and working model in Africa. On the UN peacekeeping, of course, we have been in contact also with the Ethiopians and their concerns. And globally, the UN peacekeeping forces is very much of an issue for the United States. And our government is looking at the various peacekeeping forces and how to put what resources where. So we will definitely maintain that conversation with them because we have heard the same thing that you have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Mr. Secretary, just one final point, and that is, how would you characterize the forces working against the ambassador right now in terms of his trying to move these reforms forward within Ethiopia?
As I mentioned, it's certainly not a done deal. The situation is still very fragile. We know that there are reactionary forces at work as well. They may have been partially part of the reason that the Somali region so erupted in violence recently. That's why I think it's critically important for the Friends of Ethiopia at this time to be as supportive as possible so that Prime Minister Abiy can go back to the people and show actual concrete results. Because one point I make over and over again is that the young people of Africa, and they are young people of Africa, have exactly the same dreams and ambitions as young people everywhere else, thanks to modern technology. And that's the kind of life they want. That's what they're expecting from their own leaders. And the enlightened leaders understand this, and they want to respond very quickly, because otherwise they won't have much of a future.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, and we look forward to working with you going forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the panel. Thank you.
I'd like to now welcome our second panel to the witness table, and I'd like to yield to Mr. Kaufman to do the introductions for our first two distinguished witnesses.
I'll let him sit down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce our second panel. Gerum Ale-Emayahu is the co-founder of the Ethiopian American Development Council. He is also a founding member of a sister organization, Ethiopian American Civil Council, based in Aurora, Colorado. He plays a leading role in several civic engagement and humanitarian projects in Colorado. Mr. Ale-Emayahu is the co-founder and co-chairman of the Taste of Ethiopia, a nonprofit Base, a nonprofit based in Denver that promotes Ethiopian heritage, community services, and a festival that brings together over 10,000 people each year. Mr. Alime Yahu grew up in Ethiopia and studied philosophy and played soccer in Addis Ababa University. He pursued a Master's of Science in Agricultural Education from Oklahoma State University and is a PhD candidate in the Walden School of Public Administration. Thank you for being here today. We look forward for your testimony. Do you want me to do the second one?
Yes.
Okay. And then I'm proud to introduce from Colorado as well, Jamal Syed is the president of the Oromo community of Denver and a human rights activist. He grew up in the Oromia regional state of Ethiopia and came to the United States in January 1999, seeking refuge from persecution. He graduated from Columbia College in 2009 with a degree in business administration. He is married and has 4 children and lives in Aurora, Colorado. Thank you for testifying before the subcommittee today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. I'd like to now introduce as well Emily Estelle, who is a senior analyst for the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute and the Africa Team Lead. She studies Salafi jihadi movement in Africa, including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and associated groups. Ms. Estelle specializes in the Libya conflict and has expertise in the Horn of Africa. Ms. Estelle also coordinates the Critical Threat Project's training and tradecraft and manages the integration of technology into a research process. Ms. Estelle graduated summa cum laude from Dartmouth College with a BA in anthropology, modified with Arabic language. We then will hear from Yosef Benoit, who is the Senior Program Officer for Ethiopia at Freedom House. Prior to his position at Freedom House, he was the Secretary General of the Ethiopian Human Rights Council, Ethiopia's foremost human rights organization. Mr. Benoit fled Ethiopia in 2009 when government attacks on the Ethiopian Human Rights Council became more persistent. When he arrived in the U.S., Mr. Benoit continued his advocacy for human rights protection and good governance. In 2010, he received the Alison de Forge Award from Human Rights Watch for his activism. Mr. Benoit has an LLB from Addis Ababa University and LLM in Human Rights from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. We will now begin. Yes. Put on your microphone, please. Thank you.
Chairman Smith, ranking member Bass, and distinguished member of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the situation in Ethiopia. I would like to open my testimony first by thanking my representative, the Honorable Mike Kaufman from Colorado District 6, for his support to the Ethiopian American constituents in his district and for giving us the forum to voice our concern about current developments in Ethiopia. I also would like to recognize the active participation of all Ethiopians from all walks of life in advocating the passage of H.R. 128. H.R. 128 was passed on April 10, 2018, and in the same month, the long-lived struggles of the Ethiopian people resulted in disintegration of the EPRDF from within. The former Prime Minister was unable to control the situation, even after declaring the state of emergency, and resigned. Following that, a new, vibrant Prime Minister was appointed. I give full credit to Dr. Abiy Ahmed, Lamma Magarsa, Gaddu Andargacho, and Dammaqe Mokonnin for their extraordinary work in transforming Ethiopia from a looming ethnic-based civil war into unprecedented of civil peace. Ethiopia is undergoing peaceful changes unlike any that has been seen in its long history. After 27 years of dictatorial rule, Ethiopians, for the first time, are now seeing the dawn of a new day in which they are regaining hope and confidence in their future. Over the past 6 months, we have seen things none of us expected in our wildest imagination. To put some examples, the state of emergency was lifted, many political prisoners were released, Ethiopians who were denied entry into Ethiopia are now receiving a hero's welcome. Peace was finally achieved with neighboring Eritrea. The phone service and flights are reinstated. They are also working hard to reconnect the countries through the 5 roads. Some of the roads that were heavily mined are now being repaired for commercial use between the 2 countries. The government has made a significant stride towards the market economy and even offered to partially privatize some of the government-owned businesses. Ethiopian Airlines and Ethiopian Telecom are the 2 biggest that are slated for privatization. The press is operating without being muzzled by the government, and independent media networks are allowed to work from Ethiopia. With all the changes happening there are some worrying events. All over the country, nearly 2 million people have been forced out their homes to escape violence, particularly Oromos from the Ethiopian Somali region, Gedios from Oromia, Walaitas from South region, and Amharas from Benishangul Gumuz. Most of them are women, children, and the elderly. The attempt to take the life of the new prime minister at a public support rally in Addis Ababa this June has yet to be resolved, in spite of help from FBI investigator from USA. There were highly publicized cases of mob justice in Shashamane, in Oromia, and Bure in Amara regions. The terror unleashed in Jijiga, the capital of the Ethiopia Somalia region, where 6 churches were burned down, priests were killed, and people labeled as Highlanders were viciously murdered in public squares. All these signs, I believe, show the weakness in the institution that safeguard law and order, human rights, and democracy. The last 27 years, the EPRDF has weakened the institutions to be subservient to it. The US can help strengthen the institution by providing resources for capacity building of the Human Rights Commission, the Election Commission, and the Broadcast Authority as independent, competent, and credible institutions. We would like the USA to urge the Ethiopian government to create an independent commission to conduct a full, credible, and transparent investigation into the killings, detention, torture, and instance of excessive use of force by security forces, and hold accountable security forces accused of such actions through public proceeding, and to publicly release written findings from such an investigation. Organize an independent commission that oversees the recognition of the Human Rights Commission, the Election Commission, and the Broadcast Authority to be independent institutions. Conduct full, credible, and transparent investigation into the recent ethnic violence that led to loss of life and displacement of a large number of Ethiopians, including those that targeted Amharas in Benishangul, Oromo in Somali region, Gedios in Oromia region, and Walaitas in Southern region, and hold accountable those responsible for these human rights violations. And to call for an open, constructive dialogue with all the opposition forces, both at home and abroad, armed and peaceful, in order to chart the country's future together. I know, Mr. Chairman, Under your leadership, your committee and this House will do its part for well-being of the Ethiopian people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you today. I stand ready to answer any question you might have.
Thank you so very, very much. Mr. Said.
Chairman Chris Smith, Ranking Member Karen Bass, members of Congress, Ambassador Tabor Naj, fellow panelists, and a distinguished guests. I offer my gratitude to my Congressman, Mike Kaufman, great ally of the Ethiopian American in his district, for the opportunity to represent not only Oromo community of Denver, but to speak to the concern shared by Oromo in the other community across the U.S. and Ethiopia. When we brought to use the demand of the Oromo youth, we who are known as Kero, we in the diaspora stepped up to speak for them because their voices were not heard in international community. Now with many of the reforms, voices that were once silenced are finding expression and can be heard. And we are grateful that you, Chairman Smith, and the Ranking Member Bass have followed up with congressional delegation to Ethiopia on August 23rd, where you recognized, spoke with Kero in Addis Ababa. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's strong reforms are certainly to be celebrated. Now, it is necessary to consolidate and build on these reforms in order to bring opportunity and prosperity to the Kero and to the country. Everyone thought that Ethiopia was on the verge of collapse until the Kero proved to be disciplined, sustained, and nonviolent in their modern form of resistance. They created the opening that ushered in this era of change. I want to remind you of the need to ensure that the benefit and the opportunity created now reach the grassroots. Those who took the greatest risk and made the greatest sacrifice must not be forgotten or marginalized again. At this point, most key demands of the Oromo protesters have not yet been met, but they have hope, and we have hope. The first is land rights. The first line of resistance was over the loss of ancestral land. This matter has not yet been addressed. The land of indigenous Oromo, Anuak, Sidama, and many other peoples were turned into commodity for sale or lease without their knowledge or consent. Another is language rights. A major demand of Oromo youth is to gain access to opportunity and share prosperity. The need to adopt Afan Oromo as the federal working language in Ethiopia alongside Amharic remain a top priority. In day-to-day reality, access to a vast array of opportunity is currently blocked for those who do not speak Amharic. Another key demand is for justice and accountability. You should be aware that despite the release of prisoners in Ethiopia, the killings and the displacement of Oromo and other people in some areas has intensified, particularly in East Hararge, West Hararge, Bale, Guji, and the Borana. Over 2 million people were now displaced across the country, destitute, in urgent need of international assistance to be resettled back in their homes. The many cases of disappearance and imprisonment with torture highlight the need for an independent commission created to conduct full investigation and release its finding and recommendation regarding the demand of inclusive governance. Ethiopia is a home to multiple communities who have been marginalized. A democratic federal system where power is now monopolized at the center can ensure that diverse views and interests in Ethiopia are served. To attain a transition to democracy from authoritarian rule, free and fair election must be carried out in the context of robust civil society with an in-person and independent electoral board. I summarize my written remark by saying that the daily lives of ordinary Oromo and Ethiopian people have not yet improved. But the people have hope and that they have appreciated the opening offered by Abiy's reform. Even the Cairo from the most deprived area will point out the marginalization has become deeply institutionalized. To undo the arrangement takes vision, time, patience, collaborative effort. The Cairo are eagerly committed to joining in the task. They understand that the US Congress has been a great ally who stood with them. We in the diaspora are pleased to continue to play supportive role in this journey. Finally, my written testimony includes my recommendation to subcommittee, which I believe will help Ethiopia transition to democracy. Thank you for this opportunity. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remaining of my time.
Thank you so very much. And I'd like to now ask Ms. Estelle if you could give us your testimony.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak about Ethiopia's strategic importance. I will focus on the implications of Ethiopia's potential destabilization and present risks to U.S. national security interests in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is a key partner to secure U.S. interests. I'm aware of the current optimism about its trajectory, and I want to share that optimism, but I must raise reasons for concern. There's a risk that local and regional conflicts exacerbated by geopolitical competition will destabilize Ethiopia and expose the weakness of partner-reliant U.S. strategies. Direct U.S. interests are at risk in the Horn of Africa, including the fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and freedom of movement in the Red Sea. Ethiopia faces a rapid political transition and ethnic conflict that could escalate and challenge its stability. Much of the unrest is on the border of the Somali regional state, where Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed also faces resistance to his consolidation of power. Sustained conflict could mobilize Ethiopia's ethnic Somali population, potentially creating an opportunity for Al-Shabaab to recruit or even attack in Ethiopia. The Abiy government approach, which includes mass arrests and internet blackouts, could exacerbate rather than solve the problem. Instability in Ethiopia would undermine U.S. efforts to neutralize Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda's Somalia-based affiliate, and reverberate regionally. Persistent ethnic violence or an insurgency from anti-Abiy security officials would draw the regime's focus inward, affecting regional peacekeeping and diplomatic efforts. American, Somali, and African Union forces have disrupted Al-Shabaab in central Somalia and improved security in Mogadishu, but have not yet broken its hold on large areas of southern Somalia. These gains will evaporate if Ethiopia, Kenya, or Uganda, which faces an escalating political crisis, falters and redeploys troops home. The problem of Al-Qaeda and ISIS must also be considered alongside issues of human rights and democracy. These groups gain strength by defending and governing Sunni populations made vulnerable by conflict and societal disruption. Conditions in Ethiopia could create this opportunity. Ethiopia's conflicts typically divide along ethnic lines rather than confessional or sectarian ones. But al-Qaeda has a strategy of co-opting ethnic conflicts and is succeeding this way in West Africa, for example. Both al-Qaeda's and al-Shabaab's ambitions extend beyond Greater Somalia, which includes parts of eastern Ethiopia, to all of East Africa. ISIS, which is growing in Somalia, could also target Ethiopia. Legitimate and responsive governance for all Ethiopians both protects their human rights and inoculates them against extremist organizations. The Ethiopia-Eritrea rapprochement is another positive development that nonetheless raises threats to U.S. interests. The UAE's facilitation of the agreement occurs in the dangerous context of a larger contest among Middle Eastern states. Escalating geopolitical competition in the Horn of Africa is layering proxy conflicts onto existing fault lines and increasing the potential for instability, even while generating some positive effects. Power plays by external actors have caused political turmoil in Somalia, weakening the federal government on which the U.S. counter-al-Shabaab strategy relies. Militarization of the Horn and the southern Red Sea has already affected commercial trade and threatens freedom of navigation. Russia and China are also expanding their influence. The Ethiopia-Eritrea rapprochement may accelerate this trend as Russia strikes basing deals with Eritrea, and Djibouti, which is home to a vital U.S. base, faces potential isolation that may drive it towards China. Experiences elsewhere have shown that supporting strongmen does not guarantee security. Ethiopia is no exception. In supporting Ethiopia, we must recognize that redressing legitimate grievances and protecting human rights yields long-term security dividends. Investment in good governance and security also prevents groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS from attempting to co-opt local grievances. The U.S. must also weigh the values of outsourcing foreign policy objectives to partners against the potential adverse effects of their involvement. The U.S. can begin to shape its approach to Ethiopia in two ways. By first, using all available tools to help Prime Minister Abiy demilitarize his response to ethnic violence, resolve internal disputes, and conduct necessary structural reforms peacefully and acceptably to all sides. Second, ensuring that the U.S. remains the sole guarantor of its interests in the region by not relying on the UAE or any other outside power to manage these interests. Ethiopia is a critical country in an increasingly important region. The U.S. must recognize the dangers of rapidly changing dynamics in the Horn of Africa to prepare for worst-case scenarios, even as we regard new developments with optimism. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Badwaza.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to testify before you today. And I would also like to recognize the subcommittee's great leadership on human rights issues on Ethiopia. We are witnessing a pivotal moment in Ethiopia's history. If reform succeeds, Ethiopia could become one of the world's few victories for democratic governance with significant implications for the entire continent. Since the selection of Abiy Ahmed as the Prime Minister, we have seen many positive changes. Since a lot of the positive developments have been raised in the first panel and by my distinguished panelists, I would like to focus on the challenges and the recommendations that we would like to make the change even deeper and more inclusive. The positive steps of releasing thousands of political prisoners and the amnesty for opposition party members, including those that are designated as terrorist organizations by Ethiopia's parliament, and also the plans to limit the term of the Prime Minister's office by making constitutional changes and initiating legal reforms, including the Charities and Societies, the anti-terrorism law, and the plans to liberalize the economy, ending the state monopoly, and by appointing reform-minded executives to key economic positions is something we should all be recognizing. And another key positive step is also the move that the new Prime Minister took to end 20 years of hostilities between Ethiopia and Eritrea. When it comes to the challenges, again, despite the many positive developments, these challenges still remain. The first one is while popular support for Abiy and reformers in the ruling party appears to be strong, internal power struggles have not yet been resolved. Powerful members of the establishment are not completely convinced of the wisdom of reform measures and continue to lament that EPRDF is abandoning its ideological foundations of developmental state and revolutionary democracy in favor of neoliberalism and populist tendencies. Because there has been minimal distinction between the state and the ruling party, the internal EPRDF crisis directly impacts the way the government conducts its business. As a result, party and government officials who are not on board with Abiy's reform agenda are in a position to derail reforms. There is also a need to revive the challenge of reviving independent media and civil society that have been decimated through years of violence from the government and draconian legislation. Ethnic-based clashes also threaten the pace and sustainability of reforms as fear of protracted violence and political instability persist. In the past few months, ethnic-based identity clashes killed hundreds of civilians and displaced over 1 million. Government strategy in this area seems to be largely reactive. With the liberalization of the political environment and the new tolerance for free speech, we have seen heightened nationalistic and identity-based rhetoric putting enormous strain in the long tradition of coexistence among Ethiopian ethnic communities. The anti-government protests that led to the current change in Ethiopia were primarily organized and led by the youth. Reform measures are generating high expectations among the youth and could lead to resentment and unrest if left unmet. Armed members of former insurgent groups are returning home. It's not clear whether these former fighters have gone through proper demobilization, rehabilitation, and reintegration processes. The injection of such forces into an already tense environment could easily fuel violence, and there have been incidents of violent confrontations between government security forces and these former fighters. Other than promising to make the next elections free and fair, the government has not yet rolled out a roadmap for electoral reforms, nor has it conducted constitutionally required census that was postponed in November 2017 for security reasons. Updated census data is crucial for elections. Past findings were bitterly contested and led to violence. Lack of public trust in the security services is also a challenge. While there have been encouraging signs of restraint by security forces dealing with crowds in recent months, public trust in law enforcement remains very low, and numerous instances of abuses remain unaddressed. Widespread skepticism about the government's handling of the June bombing at the pro-Abiy rally in Addis Ababa, and also the death of the chief engineer of the Grand Renaissance Dam reflects that trust deficit. This, in the future, poses a serious problem, impeding legitimate law enforcement work and resulting in extra-legal measures as observed in recent months in parts of the country. Some policy recommendations that we would like to propose are for the United States to ensure the viability of reforms. The United States should press the government of Ethiopia to mend long-standing ethnic grievances. Abiy's vision of unity, reconciliation, and inclusion should include concrete strategies aimed at fostering social cohesion. The government should seek to prevent and resolve violent clashes in a manner that involves affected communities by establishing an early warning system and investigating and punishing perpetrators. It is critical that the government address youth expectations, undertaking economic reforms to generate job creation, provide education opportunities that allow youth to opportunities for the future. With national and elections in less than 2 years, the importance of thorough reforms to ensure free and fair elections cannot be overstated. Eliminating draconian barriers to participation, including political party registration rules, the structure and composition of the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia, and the number of seats in Warada and Kabale councils are some of the long-standing questions that need to be addressed before any credible election is to be conducted. Conducting the overdue census should also be part of preparations for elections. The government should accelerate the process of reforming the criminal justice system too, including revising and repealing repressive laws that impede freedoms of expression, association, and assembly, and importantly, ensuring that the revision of these laws should be transparent, include all stakeholders, and occur in a timely manner. There is also a need to ensure a system of accountability for serious human rights abuses that occurred over the past 27 years of EPRDF rules. This may not necessarily mean that aggressive prosecutions should occur, but it could entail a truth commission or another form of inquiry that allows the opportunity to air grievances, question officials, obtain documents, and seek closure. Such an approach can forestall extra-legal acts of vengeance against former ruling party officials. There is also a need to reform the judiciary and law enforcement. This to undertake comprehensive reform of these sectors to make them independent of political control and influence. The police forces and courts have been routinely used to level spurious and politically motivated charges against critics of the ruling party. Revision of restrictive laws, such as the Anti-Terrorism Proclamation, will have little impact in the absence of reforms to the criminal justice system itself. The US could also help deepen political reform in Ethiopia by increasing US financial and technical support for elections, including capacity building for institutions such as the National Election Board. The 2019 local elections will be a key test for Abiy's ability to advance his reform agenda and could build positive momentum and experience leading up to the 2020 national elections. The US also should provide robust support to strengthen civil society and independent media. This would take advantage of the new political space and test its breadth and practice. To the extent allowed by Ethiopian laws, the US should also support capacity building for political parties, which are underdeveloped after years of repression and in need of assistance if they are to offer meaningful competition. The US could also encourage substantive engagement in the reform process by the US-based diaspora, which could include exchange programs that aim at mentorship of professionals in key sectors associated with reform efforts. Finally, if reforms continue to advance, the US can strengthen economic ties with Ethiopia and expand US economic support to assist the new government and in providing tangible democratic dividends to a broad swath of population, enabling political reform to become clearly associated with an improved standard of living in what remains a largely impoverished country where growth has been unevenly distributed. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Badwazi, thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to yield to Ranking Member Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of quick questions, but let me just begin by thanking all of you, because in each of your comments, and we have your written documents here, you give very specific recommendations. So I was just speaking with a member of my staff that I want to compile all of those recommendations and look and see, where we might be helpful. But I just have a couple of questions. I believe it was Alamehu who mentioned the Independent Commission. Did you mention an Independent Commission? And I wanted to know, because you said that in the context of how the U.S. could be helpful, and I wanted to know what you meant, who would be on an Independent Commission. And you also mentioned, I believe, people being, especially the Roma people, being forced out of their homes and people going back, and how did you see that process taking place?
Thank you for the question. When I meant the Independent Commission, through the last 27 years, every institution is either diminished or became subservient of the dictatorial.
No, I understood that. Who would be on an Independent Commission?
So on this Independent Commission, we are, I'm contemplating Ethiopians who have, independent view of this ethnic federalism to be in that part and see the election commission, the election, to watch the election and to prepare for that. And also I'm putting that with the watchful eye of the United States with the support.
So it was also mentioned about the Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act and the U.S. government applying to Ethiopian government officials. Why would we do that right now? And who would you be targeting? I mean, I know some of the offenders Prime Minister Abiy has gone after himself.
I think all this is related to the capacity of the Ethiopian police investigators. In the last June assassination attempt towards Dr. Abiy or the rally, just end up nowhere, and no public explanation is rendered as far as the attempt was concerned. Maybe this is an opportune time for the United States to help in expanding that investigation and let the Ethiopians know about it. On the other question, the Oromos, where it is in the Somalia region, when the Somali region leader forced, due to the territorial or some kind of misunderstanding there, a lot of Oromos were pushed out of from the Somali region, and they were not reinstated well yet. So, and this probably is, it goes to the capacity of the Ethiopian government. We are right now with the enthusiasm that Dr. Abiy brought with the reconciliation and peace and unity, how that is translated into the ground on that region is still questionable.
Okay. Do any other panelists want to contribute? Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Bass. Over 2 million Oromos who displaced from the Somalis region. It is not, Oromos and the Somalis have never conflict. They are brothers. They are the same people. The displacement is politically motivated by the TPLF regime. As far as the Magnitsky goes, for the atrocities that has been committed for the 27 years, the country has been looted. When you made the youth and the communities in Ethiopia. You have heard the stories of Kafalo Tafari, the young Oromo man who were snatched from the street and put in prison, and then he lost his 2 legs in the chambers of torture chambers.
So I was trying to get at if you were suggesting that the Magnitsky Act be enforced before there is a truth and reconciliation process within Ethiopia, or that would be one of the results. Again, when I looked at your recommendations and I mentioned I want to compile them, I'm just trying to figure out then how to move forward with them. So there would be a reconciliation and then the U.S. would respond, or you're saying that the U.S. should respond before?
I am sure, I think in House Resolution 128, the Magnitsky Human Rights Act apply globally. So the U.S. could act now to those offenders who are on, some of them who are on the runs. For example, the head of security forces, Getachew Asafa, is on the run.
Right.
So the United States can be able to apply that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Let me just ask a few questions about, first of all, on trafficking. In the earlier panel with the ambassador, the secretary, raised the issue of human trafficking in Ethiopia. I've actually, 15 years ago or so, went to a shelter in Addis that was funded by the U.S. government largely, and many of the women there had been trafficked into the Middle East, and they were the lucky ones who obviously came back, were rescued, and they were learning some excellent skills so that they could be employed. And again, the U.S. taxpayer was funding much of it, and I think it's a great use of our dollar to help people who have been horribly abused. But Ethiopia remains on Tier 2, and it has some very huge gaps, particularly in the area of child sex trafficking. And I would hope all of you, if you want to respond or not, but would take back that we need to keep this as a priority in our dialogue with the new Prime Minister and his government. He has inherited, as I said before, just one problem after another, and certainly the cruelty that is imposed upon women and children with trafficking is among the worst on the planet. So I just would encourage you that we all be very proactive and helpful with his government on that. And if you wanted to speak to that, please do. On the issue of truth and reconciliation, you know, the South Africans really wrote the book on that, with Desmond Tutu leading the 17-member panel back in 1995. And if my memory is correct, some 21,000 people were interviewed. It became a very, very highly visible process, and there were some trying and successfully destroying documents leading up to its creation and even after its creation to avoid the accountability that this would help bring. But it had that incredibly laudable impact of moving the country forward. And my hope is, and Jamal, you had that in your testimony today, it's certainly something that needs to be very seriously considered, but obviously the call is to be made by the Ethiopian government itself. If you wanted to further elaborate on that, that would be excellent. And if I could, you know, Ms. Estelle, you again brought up, you know, I think one of the things, my big takeaways we got on the plane to come back was that there needs to be a managing of expectations by all the ethnic communities. This is going to take a long time, even though some very high impact things have been done by the Prime Minister and done very successfully. Everyone's talking positively, but we got to make sure that everybody do not at some point say, oh, well, now we're disappointed, and then there's a reversion back to violence, and which would be the worst possible scenario. We need to stay at this no matter how long it takes, and to encourage peaceful transition and reconciliation among all the disparate elements of the Ethiopian society. And again, Ms. Estelle, you did bring out that very, very dangerous situation with the Somali ethnic community, and maybe you would want to elaborate on that further. I did ask the Secretary, pursuant to your testimony, about that earlier. I would appreciate that. And Mr. Benoit, you, on the elections, you know, everyone always wants an election ASAP, but it's got to be done right with a full accounting as to who is eligible to vote. And the whole process. I was there in 2005, when President Melis hijacked the election, and it was one of the worst processes I've ever seen for election. And so, you know, we want a free and fair and totally transparent election. So the United States, I know, can be helpful to the Ethiopians. What date should there be? Should it be an aspirational goal, or should it be more hardened as to when that day should be? Parenthetically, Karen Bass and I and staff, we were slated to go to the DR Congo right after our visit to Ethiopia, and we couldn't get in. We were denied a visa by the president. And of course, the issue of elections there and the postponement of, for what I believe to be nefarious purposes, to stay in power, not because all the I's are not dotted and the T's crossed, but we've got to be helpful to the Ethiopians to get that right as well. And I think you can speak to that very well, if you would, from Freedom House. So, and then I'll yield to Mike for any questions he might have, please. Truth and reconciliation. And one other thing, if I could, Archbishop Desmond Tutu had the gravitas to lead that, the respect of so many to lead that. Are there people within the church community or the human rights community or whatever that would come to mind? You don't have to name names, but I'm sure there are some people who would play that role fairly and dispassionately, so that it can be a very, very positive experience for the country.
Thank you. On the first question on trafficking women's children from Ethiopia to other countries, this issue is very rampant and very common in Ethiopia in every direction. And it's, as I see it, it relies upon the economic capacity of the country. Many young women eluded by some dealers in the farmland or in the remote part of Ethiopia, telling them, there is an opportunity in other country. Well, there is no opportunity in their village. So they are subject for this kind of sex trafficking, and as we have been seeing in our recent history. So on this situation, the United States can play a lot in helping small neighborhood capacity building and creating an opportunity, helping the government, to create an opportunity within the village, so that young girls are not traveling from rural area to town to create an opportunity to earn a living and support their poor family. We know that Ethiopians, we are stricken by poverty. We have only our determination to succeed. So that's what the young kids, girls going to somewhere they don't know, with nothing in their hand to support their family. So it is a capacity building, a help, an opportunity in the village. On the second question, on the peace and reconciliation, I work with churches, I serve in church, and there are Ethiopians, usually we respect the elderly and religious figure. So we can use the religious figure in Ethiopia, the elderly, to channel this very abstract concept of peace and reconciliation. Because the peace and reconciliation process that we are in is good. We don't know where it ends, because sometimes accountability is missing in that peace and reconciliation. So my suggestion is with an academic think tank, with religious figures, we can, the United States help in formulating or helping the government to formulate some kind of elderly group who can, explain this peace and reconciliation to the young people who are expecting a result right now. And I don't think, the current situation allows to satisfy all the young generation to achieve economic prosperity and what they were expecting from the new government. So that is my suggestion, trying to formulate an elderly group based upon religious fathers, figures. Thank you.
Again, thank you. To respond to the trafficking, it is very important to raise what was happening for the last 27 years. The TPLF and their families owned trafficking companies. Trafficking has been legalized in Ethiopia very much. They are the ones who transport young men and women to the Arab countries and everywhere. But in another side, they are accepting money from the United States government to prevent trafficking. But in the other side, they are the ones who involved in trafficking. On this, thanks to our youth and Dr. Abiy, with Dr. Abiy administration and with the removal of TPLF from power, the trafficking can be under control. As far as the truth and the reconciliation goes, I'm sure you have met Abagada Bayena Sambato in your visit to Addis Ababa. He's a leader of Abagadas in Oromo. So the civics association needs to be strengthened. Civics association like a Gada system need to be strengthened in Ethiopia, because for the last 27 years, the TPLF eroded, totally wiped out the civic societies. So with the elders, we can have significant changes, and then we have a proven result, because the Oromo elders have played a significant role with the Somali elders to bring the change that we are seeing in Somali's region now. So I'll say strengthen the civic society in Ethiopia and repeal the Anti-Terrorism Law Act and the charity law, so that will help. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, to speak briefly to your question about the Somali population and Al-Shabaab, the main point I want to make is that just because the conflict in that region is not yet connected to Al-Shabaab doesn't mean that it can't become that way. So Al-Qaeda globally has a strategy of working within local conflicts and essentially changing their character to serve their own objectives. So if we look at West Africa right now, there's a case where groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups have taken on the rhetoric of local ethnic conflict and inserted themselves into conflicts and gained support that way. And so I think that that's a possibility that we must be very aware of in Ethiopia if conflict persists and continues to fester, particularly in an environment where Al-Qaeda leadership is emphasizing East Africa as a place for expansion right now. So while I don't think this is an immediate concern, it's one that we certainly need to be prepared for, especially with Ethiopia's regional importance. Where Ethiopia goes, the region is going to follow. So It's the worst case, but one that we must guard against. Thank you.
Chairman Smith, thank you. I would like to make a contribution on the issue of reconciliation and truth commission. It's been said, I think rightly on the first panel, that the set of issues in Ethiopia and elsewhere are clearly different, and this calls for, I think, a deeper examination of what is on the ground on Ethiopia. To start with, we still have the same ruling party technically in power that is being accused of all the atrocities that have occurred in the past 17 years. So there is going to be a lot of interests that are going to be affected when we embark on this path of ensuring accountability. But the key is, I think, where the majority of citizens seem to be in agreement, is that there needs to be some process which may be an opportunity to air grievances, which may be to provide an official sort of a national closure, which may be a forum for people who have suffered so much over the past 27 years at the hands of the security forces, essentially with torture chambers and even in some cases unmarked graves of dissidents being accused of. So the issue for me is to carefully analyze what model would be effective for Ethiopia, and not to lose sight of the fact that there is an imperative to at least provide this forum for airing grievances. On the issue of, I think, the elections, that is where I see, I think, the enormous task where Abiy's new government is going to be tested in terms of delivering and addressing expectations. One thing in these connections that I would like to make a point is that as the reforms take root and as the changes got broadened, there is also a need to expand this new group of leadership that Ethiopia is having to wider and more reform-minded people. In other words, as we encourage the Prime Minister to carry on the path that he's being following, there is a need also to get him and encourage him to continue some sort of embarking on some sort of a delegation of powers and introducing many other supporters of the change to the fore, so that he should not necessarily be personally expected to do a lot of the things that is expecting him to. Coming back to the elections, if we start with the 2019 local elections, which have been postponed from this year, there is an enormous logistical and technical challenges that need to be made first. The first one is that there is this notion that there are over 3.5 million seats across the country that need to be filled by the local and national elections. And this is partly what EPRDF deliberately did since 2008 to discourage opposition parties to be able to field candidates. So there is a lot of questions from these newly reviving opposition groups to fix that system before any election is going to take place. There is also this long-standing issue of the independence of the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia. It has been widely recognized as a rubber stamp body where successive elections were won by EPRDF very single-handedly with 100% difference. So there is this crucial task of doing these reforms before thinking of the logistical aspects of elections. And increasingly, these opposition groups are indicating that these changes should be given a priority. So I think other than, in addition to supporting the Prime Minister and his team to deepen these reforms, it would be wise to encourage them to roll out their plan first and have the stakeholders a say in what is being planned. It could be conducting the elections now, or it could be maybe waiting a little bit so that everyone could have their views aired, so that we will not be going back to the types of elections that have been taking place in Ethiopia for the past 27 years. So the logistical and technical and also legal challenges need to be addressed first. And I think the US could be very helpful in encouraging the government, one, and providing technical support to the legal reform process that is taking place right now, that is expected to help civil society organizations and the independent media speak freely, engage the government and other stakeholders in wide-ranging democratic processes, including the elections.
Thank you. Before yielding to Mike Kaufman, I just would note that during our visit, and we've worked on this in this committee for years, what I raised with Prime Minister Abe, I should say, the issue of the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday and food security. I gave him Roger Thoreau's book, which is entitled, and he's been one of the experts who has testified before this committee, on the importance of the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday to mitigate child mortality, to hopefully put a huge dent in stunting, which is a huge problem in Ethiopia and elsewhere, to increase the strength and ability of women to overcome some of the problems that lead to maternal mortality. If the food and the supplementation is sufficient, both mother and baby are healthier. And obviously for the child, some of the cognitive loss that occurs when there is food insecurity can never be reclaimed. So this is that critical window. So for the record, I gave Roger Thoreau's book to him. I made a strong appeal to him to work, obviously, with his own government, but also to work with us, because USAID does have a very robust program on this, led so ably by Beth Dumford at USAID on the first 1,000 days. So I hope all of us, while we're working on the political side, and I know you all do this, continue to emphasize the humanitarian and health side as well. We will do an additional hearing on this in the near future, but I just want to get that on the record. Prime Minister seemed very empathetic to those goals, obviously. So first 1,000 days is transformational. I have never seen in my entire career one program that can do so much. I mean, the PEPFAR program, all those do enormous good in mortality, morbidity, really stopping deaths attributable to AIDS and the like. But this one, it's just, the kids are stronger, the mothers are stronger, and the next 25 or 30,000 days of their lives are that much improved when you get the first 1,000 correct. So I'd like to yield to Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you. I just have one final question for all the panelists, starting with you, Alame-Yehu, Mr. Alame-Yehu, and that is, how do you think that, given the history of the United States in Ethiopia, sometimes positive, sometimes not positive, but how do the people of Ethiopia and you feel about the United States right now?
Thank you, Congressman. It is a really good question, and it just touched me deeply. United States has been helping Ethiopian since the relationship began in 1903. I am one of the beneficiaries of this United States support to Ethiopia. Sometimes, as you said, it might be good, sometimes bad because of our leaders in Ethiopia, not because of United States. I came to United States from the university which is built by United States in 1953 in Alamaya. Now it's called Haramaya. That was the university I was working. It was built by United States. My first English teacher was a Peace Corps gentleman. I love him dearly, and they showed us the good of people. So I deeply thank the United States for their help, and thank you for that question. And now, in the short past, we had some, questionable support. It is not because of the United States support. It is our people who are bad on the top of, the government who are using that support to the wrong direction. So I'm suggesting any help, even if it's bad, it helps somebody in that country which needs that help. So we Ethiopians are mindful of, the United States support, and we love it. We appreciate. I am thankful of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Said. How do you view the United States, but how do you think the people of Ethiopia right now view the United States?
Thank you so much. It is a great question. Let me start from this, from the member of Congress. Some of you guys, like Representative Mike Hoffman and Representative Chairman Chris Smith, your names are household names in the Mani Oromos and most of the Ethiopian people. The Keros, not just me, the Keros who made these days possible, they believe that the United States government and the member of Congress are the greatest ally in their darkest time. We believe the help of the United States played a great role in bringing the change that we are witnessing, the changes that we see, the praise that we are giving to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was an ordinary Oromo person about a year and a half ago. So our youth struggle brought him to the front line. So I believe, as my colleague said, the role of the United States, it is not something that we see in Ethiopia and here in the diaspora, something that we see very lightly. So it is great, and we consider United States is a great ally of Ethiopia. And the other thing, something that I have to add is that Ethiopia has never been governed by the multi-ethnic democratic federalism in the past 27 years. It is led by authoritarian rules. So people need to really understand that. So multi-ethnic democratic federalism has not been tried in Ethiopia. People have been coexisted. In some cases, there are 3 different religions in one household. And we cannot compare Ethiopia to Somalia, where is just one religion. So we are very much a great example to the entire world, where religion can coexist. We believe that, we'll leave that to God. So I just want to add that. Thank you so much.
Mrs. Tell, any closing thoughts and about U.S. influence in terms of Ethiopia and where we are right now in terms of how the Ethiopian people see us?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that the U.S.-Ethiopia relationship is certainly strong. The one point I would add is that we can't take that strength for granted. I know this committee absolutely understands that, but looking at the rise of China in particular in the Horn of Africa, this week we had China refinancing Ethiopia's debt, for example. And so I do think the U.S. needs to be aware of competition in that space and where other states may be gaining influence. That said, I don't see the U.S. relationship to be particularly at risk at this time, but that there are more people bidding for that space than there have been previously.
Thank you. Mr. Benoit.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. I would say, I think from the point of view of government-to-government relationship, I agree that the relationship has been strong. As much as the Ethiopian population looks up for the United States and the type of freedom people have here and the robust democratic process that takes place here, there is also a sense of disillusionment in some occasions. For example, that comes from in recent years from the relationship being overly focused on the partnership on counter-terrorism and also overly focusing on humanitarian and development support to Ethiopia instead of publicly supporting the aspirations of people to advance democratic ideals and freedoms and to show solidarity when it is much needed in many instances. That there is, I would like to say there is a mixed sort of sentiment when it comes to assessing that relationship as far as the regular Ethiopian is concerned. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kaufman, and thank you to our very distinguished witnesses for your wisdom, for your leadership, your insights. Without objection, your full statements will be made a part of the record, and this hearing is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.